I grew up in India, and in India, and grew up with a father who's a leader his whole life, and a known leader in the civil sector. And I had a lot of negative connotations with the word leader, of like people, men with power who often misuse it, was kind of my definition of it, and or women with electoral power that struggled to use it. Those were the examples that I knew, and and yet early on I knew I had leadership qualities, and the kind of leadership that I liked exercising was one that involved engaging people in a common vision. And then as a student, as a community organizer, and I really saw that leadership is critical, because the leadership can be the holder of a vision and holder of a space, so people can actually be at their very best. And so that was my experience with personal leadership development. And yet organizationally I was fairly disappointed because I didn't see it manifested in that way, right? But about a lot of the work I now do has been inspired by the fact that I spent 3 years living in rural Kenya as a community worker in my late 20s, early 30s. And I had been a successful leader before I moved to Kenya. I had run a public infrastructure fund. I had run a research and planning department for public health. I'd done a bunch of leaderful things. And then I ended up in rural Kenya working as a capacity builder and advisor for a network of youth polytechnics, which are vocational training schools that work with rural youth who can't make it, who can't afford high school, actually. There you get trained in masonry, carpentry, things like that. And my job description for my 2-year position based within a local institution said I'd be helping modernize and upgrade infrastructure, which I knew a little bit about. Ended up being that ended up on my first day at the job, and none of the schools had electricity or roofs. So modernized took on a whole other meaning. But what the schools had, which was absolutely mind-blowing and I had never experienced before, was the most dedicated committee of management formed out of the community and elders in the community that felt like these schools were worth preserving even if the government had forgotten them. And my immediate supervisor for the next 3 years ended up being this man named Stephen Mitau, who was a local school teacher with 5 kids who volunteered on various different committees and boards because he was really interested in holistic, integrated community development from below, especially since this part of Kenya had been entirely forgotten by the government. So that's the context. Anyway, the story I'm going to tell you is my story of what has taught me what it means to be a leader. So I had also been a management consultant, well trained in the US at the time. So in the first 3 months, I was like, here's the trainings we're going to do, here's what we're going to work on, and here's my assessment. And Mr. Mitau was like very loving and very, like, they had chosen me. So I had been trained. If you've been chosen, then you share your skills. That's what you're here, there to do. Don't waste people's time by being condescending and just being like, I'm just going to sit back and chill while, you tell me what to do. Actually make yourself useful. So I was making myself useful, and one of my assessments was that this one school that had monthly burglaries and no roof, and all the school supplies were constantly being lost. In the meantime, the principal had just built himself a new house and had sent his children to college. So I came back and I presented my assessment, which was, here's what we need in this school, here's what we need in this school. But in this one school in Kativo, this guy is stealing. And I can guarantee you, he has a bad reputation and his cronies are involved and we need to do something about it. And Mr. Mitau said, yes. And so I said, okay, are we going to make a plan? And he's like, yes. So I went back again 2 months later, and I was like, I got busy. I had a lot of projects. There's a lot of people to work with and get to know. Went back 2 months later, and I said, Mr. Mitau, I'm really concerned. This is continuing. The parents are starting to pull kids out of that school. I mean, this was such a poor part of Kenya where people were selling parcels of their land to send their kids to these schools. It was unconscionable what was happening. And Mr. Mittal said, yes, we shall see. And I was just like, okay. In the meantime, I'd get together with other volunteers and community workers, and I'd be like, nothing's happening. So 6 months go by, and on the 7th month, I'm ready to lose it. And Mr. Mittal says, oh yes, we've decided to address the situation. We're going to have a meeting. Please be there. All the principals from all of these schools that were working jointly that had actually brought me to rural Kenya, we're all going to be together and we're going to address the situation. And I was like, oh, finally. It took 8 months, we're here, So we go into the village. The meeting is deliberately held at Kativo, which again, from my US trained brain, was awkward. Why are we going to the place where all this is happening? We should be discussing this in a neutral location. But anyway, so we meet in the school. And when I arrive, there was all the leads of each of the management committees were there. Mr. Mittal was going to facilitate the meeting. We arrive at 10 a.m. At 11 a.m., we've just finished the first round of tea, checked in about how's the weather, how's the crops been, how's your community. At 11 o'clock, the meeting is called to order, and everybody does the formal check-in, where everybody goes through what's happening in the community, how has the months been, how have we been since the last month, what's new, what are we looking forward to, what is good. At 1 p.m. we break for lunch, and internally I'm just losing it. I'm like, it's going to be 5 p.m. because most of us had to walk or take the bus, a 3-hour commute back home. Nothing's ever going to happen. 1 p.m. we break for lunch, come back at 2:30, and then Mr. Mittal opens the post-lunch meeting and at this point I'm seething, and in the lunch break took him aside and said, are we going to get to this? And he's like, yes. So at 2:30, Mr. Mittal finally says, Brother Kilonzo, we are the stewards of our community's wealth. We are the stewards of our community's future. Is there anything you'd like to say? And the principal, who I hated with every cell in my body, who'd been stealing from the school and building the house, starts weeping. And he admits to every single burglary, every single embezzlement, every single misuse for the next hour and a half. And he cries and he admits, and people just hold him. And then a beautiful closure happens. And the lesson I learned in that was that they held up the dignity of a man who had done so much wrong. And when I asked him later, I was like, why didn't you just make him quit? Oh, the other part of the story is that not only did he admit, he resigned his position, he promised to pay back the institution, and he also promised to actually repent by doing other forms of community service for a long time to come. And, all of this happened like between 2 and 5. And it was the biggest life lesson I've ever had in leadership, I realized that it wasn't just about holding an individual accountable or implementing a policy or a process. I learned it's actually about upholding someone's dignity even in the wrongdoing, and in the process actually making such a huge transformational shift for the whole community, and for really presenting a case by which no one else would consider doing something like that, without a deep, humiliating, but also deeply responsible way. I'd never seen anything like that. I'd never experienced anything like that. It just really, really shaped me. This came from a place of such absolute love and faith, and a sense of the collective.